Hey guys, welcome back to another Hypermobile Hangout. This one is brought to you by my good friend, Darcy, who is going to be sitting in on today's session. But today I have a cool topic to talk about. I want to just break down this concept of having a hypermobile body, HEDS, or being on the hypermobile spectrum, and having muscles that are overly tonic, and that basically means overly tight. And it seems like it should be such an oxymoron, right? Like, no, like being hypermobile means you're super gummy and Gumby and like super lax. And that is totally the case, but there is also this flip side. When you have hypermobility, your body is just constantly fighting and working to create stability among throughout your whole body, across every joint. Sometimes across, one joint that may be more pronounced, that might be like your pain area. But oftentimes it's a pretty holistic thing. And when your body fights for that stability, ultimately what ends up happening is it tries to recruit muscles super constantly, in order to keep you from just falling right out of your joints. So in some ways, it makes a lot of sense, because when you're fighting for that stability, your body just kind of needs to go like, huh, and that creates all that muscle tension that, once again, kind of seems like it's a huge oxymoron. And so that's actually why I have Darcy with me today, because she is a great demonstration of basically what I'm talking about. So I'm going to start by just kind of talking about in the shoulder joint, because she's got like an easy one to pull on. This concept is oftentimes referred to with the pelvis, and I definitely want to talk about that as well, because it's a huge issue. But so, for example, I've got Darcy here. I'm going to take her off her little stand. And, with hypermobility, you've got tons and tons of range typically in the shoulder joint. And all of these little muscles kind of around that shoulder capsule, the infraspinatus, supraspinatus, all of those little babies. I don't want to get super technical here, but those little muscles are technically responsible for keeping your shoulder, your humeral bone, your humerus, your arm bone, right into its shoulder socket. But when you have hypermobility, a lot of times what can happen is those little tiny muscles have to work so much harder, and they kind of like spaz out and they get super tight. And then what happens is all of those bigger muscles, the trapezius, the lats, they start gripping in, because the little baby muscles have gotten so exhausted from trying to keep your arm from falling out of its shoulder. I know, kind of a weird concept. That the rest of the muscles are just kind of spasming and just holding on for dear life to make sure it doesn't release. And so the reason I like to use Darcy to demonstrate these kinds of things is because her shoulder quite easily pops out of its socket. And so this is just kind of the manual demonstration of, we're like in hypermobile bodies, our arms are often trying to go all the way over here, but all of the little stabilizers, like I mentioned, the ones that get very fatigued, are trying to keep us in the shoulder joint, and that's what's going to activate all of the larger muscles and create that feeling of tension. And it's a lot more kind of like technical than that, but without needing to go into all the sort of technicalities of it, that is in essence what's happening. And so by just continuing to focus on strengthening and stretching, it kind of creates this vicious cycle of never truly being able to like relax those muscles that are fighting so hard. It's like a weird juxtaposition that goes on. And I think one of the best places to talk about that, let me see if I can like get her shoulder back in. I might have to do it after the video. But I think one of the best places to talk about that, one of the most constant places that's become very or consistent places rather, that has become a very popular topic is in the pelvis. So like I mentioned, like pelvic floor issues are becoming much more prevalent and just much more discussed and researched, which is an amazing thing. Pelvic floor physical therapy specifically is finally a thing, and I am a huge proponent of it. But I also think the approach to pelvic floor physical therapy and just pelvic floor strengthening and training definitely is different for hypermobile individuals and should be treated differently. Because in normal bodies, in non-hypermobile bodies, oftentimes the approach to like working on pelvic floor dysfunction, things like incontinence, things like pain, is to do strengthening work. I'm sure a bunch of you guys here have heard the phrase Kegels before. It's basically that idea of creating like a pelvic floor contraction and lift. But if a hypermobile body is super tonic or super tight, because all the pelvic floor muscles right in this little bowl here are trying to keep your hips together, keep those thigh bones from, once again, going like that. I'm really doing a number on Darcy today. Sorry, babe. But in essence, that's where our femur bone, the thigh bone, is trying to go. Our pelvic crests, and these don't move, are trying to separate. And so, of course, all of our pelvic floor muscles are like working 20 times as hard trying to keep all of that together. And like I said, this is very subjective person to person. This is actually an experience I have had, so I am talking a little bit from personal experience here. But it's a very common issue across most people with HEDS and hypermobility, needing to deal with a hypertonic pelvic floor, a pelvic floor that's actually so tight because it's trying to keep you constantly pulled together, keep you from just wobbling all over the place, keep the lumbar spine and the sacrum, these babies, nice and stable. So of course, that's a lot of work. That's going to make you very tense and very just active all the time. So in the same concept that we talked about with the shoulder and all those little stabilizer muscles, all of these little babies start to get super fatigued. But of course, your body's not just going to let your thigh bone fall out of its socket, because it doesn't really work like that. So what starts to happen is all of these muscles, your bum, your glutes, the glute medius, the hip flexors are usually a big one for people, the ones in front that make your leg go like this. They start to kick on, and they also start to get really tight. And this becomes a big problem because basically what that does is it inhibits your joints from moving more freely. It inhibits your joints from moving in a more natural gait pattern. And that's kind of a hot button word, natural gait pattern, because it's just quite different for hypermobile people anyway. We don't really have a normal gait pattern to begin with. But we, on the flip side, getting so tight and destabilized and having all these big muscles grip you, on the flip side is also not good because it makes you too constricted. And so this is basically just what I wanted to break down today. I'm going to have to plug Darcy back in eventually. But I wanted to bring it up, and I think it's important to talk about because of the way that hypermobility is constantly approached. There's really big emphasis on strengthening and stability, and that is hugely important. But there also needs to be an emphasis on release work and finding the right times for it. And what I mean by that is, yes, just like anything, there is a time and a place to do the strengthening, do the stability. But if your body is just so wound up, if you are so tonic, so overly tight, and you just continue to try doing those Kegels, or you continue to try doing your I's, Y's, and T's and your external rotation strengthening exercises, it's not going to do you tons of good because you're already so tight. And so you could do, one thing that was a big issue for me, once again, just kind of speaking from personal experience, in addition to dealing with some of the pelvis stuff, which has actually been a lot just kind of handled and rectified, which is great. But my shoulders, it's like a work in progress for me, which is really interesting. I'm still trying to find that balance between, kind of intuiting when I'm too tight, when I'm too grippy, versus when I can really focus on doing some strengthening and stabilizing work. And I'm still finding that I'm in a phase where release work is tending to do me a little bit better. And when I'm feeling good and in alignment, then I get really good about being able to do strength work and stability work. But the reason I say that is because for me, what was happening is anytime I would try, my shoulders were rolling forward, I was getting tight and stuck because I was so unstable in my shoulders. But anytime I try to go and do strengthening work, I wouldn't even be able to fire like any of the external rotator muscles, the babies back here, these babies that I was supposed to be able to. And it's because they were just they were trying to keep my arms from falling out of their sockets, for lack of better terms. And so I ended up stepping back and kind of reevaluating and saying, okay, well, what does this mean I need to do first? It means I need to get into a little bit of a release work phase. And so I do a lot of release work on myself. I go and see manual therapists who help me with it, which always feels amazing. And when I come out of those sessions, I typically try and do a little bit more strengthening work because I actually have more access to the muscle since they've been relaxed, since they've been released, and they are able to fire more effectively, which puts me in better movement patterns and just makes me stronger overall. So I kind of feel like I was like bopping back and forth here today in this hangout. It's just, there's so much to talk about when it comes to being overly tight, because I realize it is just such an oxymoron. But this hangout is really for people who are feeling that way, who are feeling like, okay, I know I'm supposed to be hypermobile and I'm supposed to be super bendy and like lax and whatever. And that still might be the case, but it just means you're at a different phase in how you kind of approach your training, how you approach your recovery, and it might actually be that you need to focus on some release work first. And a good kind of another anecdotal example that I'll use is I'm working with a woman right now who is very hypermobile, and she's lovely and lax, and it's pretty wild, but she also is, after, she's worked with a really great osteopath and physical therapist who has gotten her out of the kind of like immediate pain she was in. And this PT osteo basically said, okay, like now it's time for you to focus on getting some strengthening work in. And it's pretty incredible because it's true, like she definitely needs strengthening work because her body needs to be able to hold all of the releases that the PT does, but she still does come in and we'll use things like tennis balls, we'll use like release tools, and we'll start most of our sessions that way because, she comes in and she's very wound up because, as you well know, being hypermobile isn't just a part-time thing, it happens all day long. And so, if she's had a stressful day, like she'll kind of come in like this. So we'll spend the first 10-15 minutes of our sessions just doing some release work and like getting her moving and into a little bit more of a flow. And it's incredible how much more access she has to her muscles, to her breath, to her movement patterns after we do that release, and then we go into strengthening work. So with that being said, I think I'm just going to kind of wind down here. Like I said, this one was kind of a little back and forth and boppity, but I just feel like it's a very important topic to talk about. And if you're one of those people that is hypermobile but is coming from the side of like almost feeling more tense or too tight, feel free to drop a note and say hey and talk about your experience, because I love hearing about these things, and also if I can offer any insight or even provide resources, I'm happy to do so, because I have been in that boat and it's definitely a weird one. But with that being said, I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.